Welcome back to the Silver Celebration here at Wagon Quilt Company. It's time for our grand finale. Here's my finished quilt. It's been beautifully custom quilted by Ramona Sorensen, who also designed our pattern this year. Huge shout out to her for all of her time and energy. It turned out beautiful, don't you think? In your kit this month, you'll find that you have fabric to add a top and a bottom border, as well as a beautiful little faux piped binding. It adds such a sophisticated detail to this traditional design. We love it. And I'm going to show you in just a moment, step by step, how to do that faux pipe binding. If you've never done one before, it might sound intimidating. It's actually very easy. If you'd like a guide to follow for future binding experiences, I highly recommend this book by Deonn Stott. It's the ultimate binding and finishing guide, and it includes 16 different ways to bind your quilt, from the basics of basics to more advanced techniques like prairie points and scalloped edges. Of course, it does include excellent instructions for the faux pipe binding. I recommend every quilter have this book in their library, and it's a great way to look back if you need a refresher. Maybe your quilt's not quite ready to bind yet. This would be a great book to remind you how this faux pipe binding is done. Are you ready for some bonuses this month? We have some fun surprises for you. If you have loved making this quilt and think you might like to make it again, you have all of the patterns now to make each of these blocks. But you might be wondering, how much fabric would I buy if I wanted to do this again in different fabrics? In your pattern this month, you'll find that we have included the yardage requirements for making this on-point setting version of the Silver Celebration. So you could make it again. Here's another fun idea. Maybe you loved making one or two of these blocks specifically. Maybe this one is your favorite. You could make a whole quilt with just that block, or pick 2 or 3, or change up the layout. You could have a lot of fun with this, and those yardage requirements will help you get a good start on another project. We have another bonus for you, but wait, there's more. Suzanne Jackman of Splendid Spec is here today, and she has put together an alternate version of this quilt that we're ready to show you. It's so fun. You ready?
Yep, I'm ready.
How cute is this? You might recognize the blocks. I hope you recognize the blocks, but how different does it look in different fabric? What was your inspiration for putting it together this way?
Well, I mostly picked my colors first that I liked, and then after that I didn't know for sure because I was testing it also for Ramona, so I just kind of picked an amount. I don't know, I just started going. I just kind of did what I liked, and I don't know, I just did it. I don't know, that's hard to explain what my inspiration. Ramona is my inspiration, really. Her blocks are so cute, and I really wanted to make it, but I'm more of a bright, colorful person, so sure. I decided I was going to do colors, and so she said, yeah, you can do it, just do it in colors, and that was all she had to say.
Yeah.
I had it done after that.
So did you just use scraps you already had?
Yeah, I just used stuff in my stash that
Things
I had.
that were your favorites and turned out darling.
Yeah.
One thing I'm noticing is the layout isn't all that different as far as the medallion.
Yeah, it's really, I like how she did that. It works well for how she did on point, but also in this way, it still makes a circle. It still goes around that middle block.
It turned out darling. I absolutely love it. So this month in your kit, you'll also find a bonus layout that you could make with your own fabrics if you'd like to, for setting this quilt not on point, in straight rows like Suzanne did. And again, you could make different blocks, you could change it up how you like, but it will have the fabric requirements and Suzanne's unique layout, so you can make another quilt. Yeah. Isn't that fun?
And it's really, you can just use your stash. It's fun.
It's a great scrap quilt.
It doesn't take a ton of fabric either.
Yeah, darling. Love it.
It was fun.
Yeah, thank you for showing.
Yeah, thanks to Ramona for letting me use her patterns. It was fun.
All right, are you ready to learn more about this faux pipe binding? Let's get to work. Here's what you'll find in your kit for October. We have fabric 1 is the taupe dot, and fabric 2 is the black dot. The first step for October is to cut from fabric 1, the taupe fabric, 4 strips that you will sew end to end in pairs, and then you'll trim them down to fit the top and bottom of your quilt. We're only adding borders to the top and bottom, making this project rectangular, and it will finish at 74 by 82 inches. Depending on the mattress you have, that could fit a twin size bed, or it can make a generous size throw or a beautiful wall quilt, of course. You could choose to leave those borders off if you'd like to keep your quilt square, and it would finish at 74 by 74, but we liked having the option of being able to use this on a bed if you'd like. Our next step will be to cut 9 strips from fabric 1 and 9 strips from fabric 2 to create our beautiful faux piped binding. When you're cutting your binding strips, you'll want to cut across the grain of the fabric from selvage to selvage, straight across, not on the bias. And there's a good reason for that when you're making a faux piped binding. We will be bringing these 2 colors together with a long continuous seam that runs the full length of our binding. And if we were to cut these on the bias, you would find you have a lot of stretch in that seam. We don't want that. We want our finished binding to lay nice and flat without any ripples or waves in this pretty little faux piping along here. So cut your binding strips straight across the grain of the fabric from selvage to selvage. This month, you'll also find a little note in your kit for an option with narrower binding, and I want to explain that for just a moment. The original October pattern gives you dimensions for cutting your strips in a way that will give you a wider binding. We're seeing that trend in the quilting world more and more often as we see more creativity and people doing things a new way. It's fun to watch for those trends. Cutting your binding a little wider will also give you a little more flexibility if this is your first time trying this technique. It's a little easier to work with a little more fabric. So that wider binding will come from using the original cutting dimensions in the October pattern. If you prefer a narrower, more traditional binding that would finish closer to the 1/4 inch binding that you see more often, for example, maybe you're a person who usually would cut your binding strips at 2 1/4 inches to get your finished binding, then you would use the cutting instructions on the little note that is in your pattern. That just gives you a little narrower edge with your main fabric. Your piping will still show like it does here. And on the back, you'll find that your stitch lines up with your ditch just a little bit closer if you are one of those people who prefers that stitch line to disappear right in that ditch. So you have 2 options for cutting this month. It's up to you. Neither one are right or wrong. They're just different, but I wanted to make sure you had that option. You can use the method you like best for sewing your strips end to end. I choose to sew mine with a diagonal seam. That eliminates a lot of bulk, but let me show you how that looks before we press that open. I take 2 strips and I lay them on top of each other, creating an X, and you can see I've left my selvage on for now and just laid that selvage past the edge of this strip enough that when I trim it off, I won't have that selvage on, but I can use as much of this fabric strip as possible. So I create this little crisscross with my selvage edge hanging over, and then I stitch diagonally from corner to corner like this. When I open that up, you'll see I have a very nice straight edge with a diagonal seam. I do want to trim these little excess pieces off, so I'll take my ruler, place the 1/4 inch line on my seam line, trim those little tails away, and then I prefer to press this seam open. And by doing that, I'm going to eliminate a lot of bulk when this binding wraps around the edge of my quilt. You can see that seam, rather than laying on top of each other on either side, I have a diagonal seam there so it wraps, eliminating a lot of bulk that we don't want in our binding. So you'll go ahead and sew your fabric 1 strips end to end using your favorite method. And again, the black strips end to end, again, using your favorite method. It's hard to see on the black fabric, this diagonal seam, but if I turn it over, you can see it there where I've pressed it open. The next step you will take is to actually cut about 22 inches off the end of this strip. Now, I know that sounds kind of strange, but let's go ahead and lay this out 22 inches on my mat. And I know you can't see this end over here, but I'm just going to make a straight cut so that I take this 22-inch tail off of my long pieced fabric 2 binding strip. Then I'm going to take this piece that I just cut off and I'm going to sew it to the opposite end of this fabric 2 binding strip. Just like I did before, I'll lay these crisscross, I'll take a diagonal seam so that I can open up there like that. Why do we need to do this? You may be wondering. By cutting that portion out and adding it to the other end, we will be staggering those pieced seams for our binding. See if I can get this where you can see it. So when I line up either end of my 2 binding strips and we're going to take a 1/4 inch seam along here. You can see where this diagonal seam here in the black fabric is not lining up with another seam on this fabric because we have cut that portion off and shifted it. So if I keep sewing along here with these 2 strips, you'll find that the seam in my taupe fabric comes along, and again, I'm not lining up with a black seam. This is another effort to eliminate as much bulk as possible in this faux piped binding so that when you finish your quilt, everything lays nice and smooth and flat, like Ramona's beautiful binding has done here. Let's take these strips to our machine and sew the fabric 1 strips to the fabric 2 strips, and then we will press that seam towards the main fabric, towards fabric 1, and we'll show you why that's important in just a moment. Here we have our 2 binding strips sewn together, and I have pressed these towards fabric 1, towards the taupe main fabric, and that creates a little ridge along here that we can follow when it's time to stitch in that ditch in our final binding step. The next thing we need to do is to fold this binding in half and press it just as we would do with a regular binding. And when I begin pressing, lining up these edges very carefully, can you see that little faux piping starting to appear there? It is important that these edges stay neatly aligned, and that will keep your faux piping uniform along the edge as we move down the quilt. Now, sometimes this gets a little hot on the fingers, so I really like to use this handy little tool by Quilted Hearts. It's a silicone pressing mat with these 2 little loops that you can slide your binding fabric under, just like so. And it is heat resistant up to, oh gosh, I think 450 degrees, something like that. It's like kind of like the baking silicone products that you see. But because it's heat resistant, I can just set it right there on my binding and then continue to pull my strips through. Of course, I don't want to leave them in one place for too long, but if I slide those through, the silicone mat holds the heat between itself and the iron, giving you a very nice crisp edge on your piping edge there. Now I am watching carefully, sliding my fingers along to keep this edge even as I feed it through. Oh, and I have one of those irons that beeps when you set it down for too long. So you might have to take a little break here and there. And here we go again. We'll continue down this strip of fabric, pressing it in half, creating that faux piping edge all the way to the end. Now that we have our faux piped binding strip pressed in half all the way down the length of our binding strips, I want to show you another really great binding tool that helps simplify our quilting lives. This is a Bindy Windy. It's by Deonn Stott, who is the author of the book we showed you earlier. And this little tool gives you an opportunity to wind your binding in a way that prevents our binding from coiling up. How many of you roll your binding into something like this, and as you start to put it on your quilt, you get this really obnoxious twist and spiral that you have to continuously try to unwind? Or like I have my big pile here, also tends to be a mess that we're constantly untangling. The idea behind the Bindy Windy is to take this little stick, hold it with your fingers, go ahead and put your binding strip here, and then we start winding in a figure 8 pattern like this. We just keep going around and around, and it always takes me a minute to kind of get things on there straight. There we go. And once you get going, you just keep moving in a figure 8 around that little stick. We'll keep going to the end. Here we go. And coming to the end, we have quite a heap of binding on that one little stick, crisscrossed in a figure 8 pattern. Now, why is this helpful? We turn this over, slide the stick out, and this is actually a great way to store your binding as opposed to in a coil like I showed you before. Maybe you're someone who likes to make your bindings ahead of time, set them aside until you're ready for them. This is a great way to store it. Then when you get it out to sew it to your quilt, set it on your sewing machine table and you start to unwind it. The beautiful thing is it comes out flat. Do you see how that's coming out? Not in a messy coil. Wonderful, right? Less hassle, less fight. works like a charm. Let's take this binding to our machine and attach it to our quilt. Anytime I sew a binding onto a quilt, I use a walking foot. And today I'm using my trusty old Bernina machine. And this walking foot, you can see, has a wider foot plate and it rocks back and forth as the stitch goes along. And that keeps all of these layers in my quilt and my binding from creating tucks and puckers. It walks evenly along the seam line. So if you have a walking foot, it's time to put it on your machine. I also like to put a sturdy table next to my sewing machine to help hold the weight of my quilt. My shoulders get a little tired, and you don't want that quilt pulling away from the needle as you sew along. You don't want to have to fight that. That ends up with a wavy line in your binding. So get a table next to your machine. Even your ironing board could work for this. We have our bindy windy binding. I'm going to set to the side here. And I forgot to show you that you probably want to put a little pin in the end of it there just to keep it together as we sew. Let's get the end of our binding strip. And we're going to start with the back of our quilt. And we want to turn our binding strip with this main fabric, the smaller fabric, facing towards the backing of the quilt. So you're going to see the black fabric facing up. Now we want about an 8 to 10 inch tail or so that is unattached to the quilt. And I like to start about halfway down one side. And we're going to use a 1/4 inch seam. My walking foot does happen to have a 1/4 inch mark on it. If yours doesn't, you might like to put one of our seam guide tape pieces or mark your sewing table so that you can watch your 1/4 inch line. I also chose to use a thread for this that is close to this taupe color fabric, just so that it blends in as I go. All right, it's time to close our binding up. I'm going to be honest, this is not my favorite part of making a quilt. However, I did learn a tip from Deonn Stott again, who originally learned this tip from Nancy Zeman, one of her viewers' favorite tips, that makes this a lot less stressful for me. So I want to share that with you today. There are a lot of different ways out there to close up bindings. There are rulers and tools, different ways of measuring and marking, and there's a lot of right ways to do this. But I've thought this was a really clever and simple way to make this happen accurately. The first thing we want to look at is the beginning tail of our binding. Remember, I left about an 8 inch piece at the beginning before I started sewing here. So we're going to call this our beginning tail. And then we have our ending tail. You can see I have quite a bit left over at the end of my binding, and I've closed my stitching, leaving about an 8 inch gap again. So it's approximately the same size as my beginning tail. Now we could go ahead and remove this excess piece off our ending tail. I'm going to bring it over even with the opening that I have left there and just clip it with my scissors. So now I have 2 tails that each will cover that opening. Okay, now this piece that we have left over, I'm going to open this up. Let me find the other end here. And I'm going to use a piece of this as a measurement tool. We want to snip a piece off that's approximately an inch or so longer than the width of your binding. This size doesn't particularly matter as long as it's big enough to work for your measurement tool. We're going to keep it opened up, and the width of this binding strip is the size that we need to measure for our diagonal seam that will close this binding. So we're going to start by laying our beginning tail across the opening. And then we're going to put this little marking tool on top of it, about centered between the opening there, between the beginning and end stitching. And then we're going to fold our ending tail over the top so that the measurement scrap is sandwiched between the 2 binding pieces. Okay, here's where things get fun. Now we're going to take a little pair of scissors and we're going to clip just an 1/8 inch notch in the edge of our binding. We don't want to cut through the quilt. But we do want to cut through all 4 layers of the binding strips here. So I'm going to snip just an 1/8 of an inch to the left of our little marking scrap. There we go. Want to make sure I get through all 4 layers, but not through the quilt. And from there, we can go ahead and fold this piece back. You can see where my notch is, just tiny. And I'm going to go ahead and fold it where my notch is and cut that tail off there. Okay, now when I lay that back across, it should come just to the edge of my marking scrap there. We'll go ahead and move this one to the other side. Now this time we're going to make a little clip, a little 1/8 of an inch notch again on the right side of our measurement scrap. It's important to note the difference. The first time we did the left side, now we're doing the right side. Another little notch here through the 2 layers of our beginning tail. And when I pick that up, I can fold at my notch again. And I'm going to double check and see now. See, I should have an overlap there, the same size as this measurement scrap. I just double check before I clip just to be safe. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and clip across there at the notch. So we can see where we have the overlap between these 2 strips that we need that happens to be just the size of our binding width. Okay, from here, we want to open up the ending tail piece here, and you can just kind of lay it out to the side. And it's helpful for me if I put a little pin in here to hold it there, just out of the way. And now for this beginning piece, we're going to open it with the wrong sides out, like this. Okay, I'm going to take a ruler, and I can see where my 1/8 of an inch notches are that went through both layers of my binding strips. And what I need to do is draw a diagonal line from one corner to the notch, the 1/8 of an inch little notch that I marked in there. We're going to draw a diagonal line across there. Or you could put little pins in there, however you choose to mark it. You could even just finger press it if you'd like, but I'm going to go ahead and draw a line across there. Okay, now that is my diagonal seam line. And when I bring these together, I'm going to take my quilt and pinch it together. You could put a little binding clip right here. I'm just going to pop a little pin in here to keep this together so I don't have to wrestle with it when I seam these together. Okay, I darkened up my diagonal line so you could see it a little bit better there. From this point, we're going to take this beginning tail and move it over, right sides together with our ending tail, so that that diagonal line goes from this corner down to the corner of the ending tail that's underneath it. We can align these edges here, and you can even feel with your fingers to make sure that this little ridge of our taupe fabric is lining up on that diagonal line with the ridge in this fabric. That will make sure that your piping lines up when we take this seam. I'm going to go ahead and put a pin there so that I know that that seam intersection will line up. And then I'm going to go ahead and pop a couple more pins in here just to keep things in place. When we get this big heavy quilt going for these small seams, sometimes it's hard to keep things aligned. So we'll go ahead and pin it a little bit extra. Let's take that to our sewing machine and take our seam right on top of that drawn line. When we bring it back, we should have a joint in our binding. Okie dokie, let's see how we did. We're going to remove this pin that's holding our quilt together and go ahead and take that pin out there. And when we open that up, wow, look at that. Fits that space perfectly. And when we turn it over, can you believe our little faux piping lines up just right too? I'm sure you can tell we probably need to cut the bulk out of that. So I'm going to just take my scissors approximately 1/4 of an inch away from that seam line. Of course, you could get your ruler and rotary cutter out, but sometimes it's hard to get in there in this tight space when we're finishing up this binding piece. There we go. I'll take that to our iron, press that flat, and then we can go ahead and sew our 1/4 of an inch seam to close that binding up. With our binding attached to the back of our quilt all the way around, we are nearing the home stretch. I like to press my binding towards the outside of the quilt before I stitch anything down on the front side, anytime I'm doing machine binding or hand binding. After I've sewn it on the machine, I take it to my ironing board and I turn a little steam on, and I just knock that binding out towards the edge of the quilt, giving it a nice crease, and that makes turning that edge around to the front so much easier. With our binding now pressed towards the outside of our quilt, it's time to bring this faux piping around the front. Whenever I use machine binding techniques, I like to run a little bead of glue-based just inside my seam allowance here, right along that sewing line. This is a product by Roxanne. It's called Glue Based It, and I love this little squeezy bottle. I tend to get tendinitis, or if you have arthritic hands, this takes a lot of the pressure off from squeezing a regular glue bottle. And this little point gives you a nice fine line of glue. I just put a little on there, go a little ways down the binding, and then I take this faux piped edge and I'm going to turn it over on top. Now I can feel a little bit with my finger where my faux pipe line is going to come together with this seam line. It's probably not going to be exact, but I want it to be close so that when I go to stitch in that ditch at my machine, things line up nicely. I use my iron to set the glue. It helps it dry just a little bit. You don't want the steam on when you do that because the steam keeps the glue wet. Use a dry iron for this part. You can see how that holds that down. When I take that to my sewing machine to sew down the front of that, it is so nice to have that already anchored in place so that I'm not trying to fuss with the alignment. I'm not guessing where my seam is going to show up on the back of my quilt because I can feel it as I do this with the glue base. There's another little section. I'm going to use my iron to set that glue, and I'll continue working around the outside of my quilt. When you come to your corners, I did miter my corners when I put my binding on the back of my quilt. So when I get to that point, I'm going to continue just as you would if you were sewing. I'll run a little glue base along that stitch line, and I'll put a little extra up here in this corner. And then you can fold just as you would when you're sewing to work that little corner into a mitered corner. Of course, it wants to give me a little fight since I'm trying to show you how nice and easy this is. Once you get that in place and press it down, I sometimes will even put a little binding clip just on that corner to hold it in place. And then I can continue down this seam line, pressing that glue and feeling with my fingers to see that the faux piped binding is landing just outside my stitch line. Let's keep going. The final step in adding the faux piped binding to our silver celebration will be to machine sew this top edge of our binding down to the top of our quilt. We're going to stitch in the ditch between the main binding fabric and the faux piping, which will create this little edge that will look as if we've added a tiny bit of cording or piping to our quilt. That's where the faux comes in. We didn't have to do that, but it looks just like we did. So to stitch in the ditch, I'm using what's called an edge stitch foot on my machine. It's not necessary to use one of these to put on the faux piped binding. You could use your regular walking foot or even your regular 1/4 inch foot, but this makes it so nice. It has a little guide that fits right down in between the machine foot here, and the needle follows right behind it. So I can set that guide right in the ditch and be assured that my needle is going to land right in that little ditch every time it stitches. It makes it so slick. So if you don't have one of these feet, I think it's a great time to invest in one. But like I said, it's not absolutely necessary. Now, one other thing I want to mention is that to put on my faux piped binding, I am choosing to use a black thread for my top thread, my needle thread, so that it blends in with the faux piping. My bobbin thread, my lower thread, I'm choosing to use a neutral color that blends in with my background because I know I probably will see some of that seam on the back. Heaven knows I'm not a perfect quilter, so I just plan ahead a little bit and pick threads that can hide with my sewing. Just following along in the ditch, nice and easy. I'm coming up to a corner here. You can see where I have glued my corner together so that it is mitered. And as I bring this foot up close to the corner with the seam guide, I'm just going to continue to stitch right up to that intersection where the faux piped binding meets the corner. And at that point, I'm going to lower my needle into that little corner and lift my foot, rotate my quilt. We're going to pivot, and then I'll set my seam guide back down where this next faux piping piece continues, and we will just keep steadily sewing along. Sometimes I have to use a little stiletto or something to bump that through that edge there, and we're on our way. Let's finish it up, should we? I am absolutely delighted with the outcome of this project, and I hope you are too. From beginning to binding, I've had a great time sewing along with you for the silver celebration here at Wagon Quilt Company. If you'd like to join us in 2026 for our next mystery sampler, registration is now open on our website, cornwagonquilts.com. Click the BOMs tab or Classes tab, and you'll see the picture for our next Mystery Sampler 2026. We hope you'll join us. I need to give a huge thanks to Ramona Sorensen for hours of work developing this design for us to use exclusively here at our shop. A big shout out to the Corn Wagon gals for all they do for us in preparing your kits and supporting our customer service. We also need to thank Sims Tanner for editing these videos. And of course, we want to thank you for joining us.